Hello and welcome to this session on methods. Methods, as you know, are really just functions but defined within a class and an object-oriented programming context. Methods will typically operate on the data that you have defined for your particular class or for a particular object instance. There are generally set type methods which will set values within your object. There are get type methods. And there will also be operational methods which will allow you to perform certain functions such as connect. In the picture on the right, you can see there are a number of attributes associated with the network device. IP address, username, password, and connection state are all attributes of this particular object. If you look below, you will see methods defined. There is an init method, and we will see that there will always be an init method, and that is used to initialize attributes. In this particular class definition, there is a set credentials method and a connect method, which perform various functions. Within every class definition, for every method, the very first parameter passed to every single method will be called self. Self is a variable that will be used to reference local attributes within this particular object. As you can see in the code on the right, we define the init function, and the very first parameter is self. And we then use self when we refer to our local attributes, self.name and self.ip address. Init is a function which is defined for every single class that is created. The init function gets called when an object is instantiated. And when an object is instantiated and parameters are passed to that object instantiation, those parameters will be passed to the init routine. So in the example that you see on the right, class network device has an init function which has parameters self, and where the ... are will be parameters representing the name of the device, the IP address of the device, and other various information. At the point of initialization, you can see that we are setting the local data self.name to the name that was passed in to the request, and we are setting self.ip address to the IP address. We are also initializing certain values that are going to be used throughout the life of this particular object. You can see that the interfaces list that we're creating is going to be empty, and the routes dictionary that we're creating is also going to be empty, and the version string will have nothing in it. There will be other methods defined for your object, such as connect, retrieve interfaces, retrieve routes, etc. But the init function is very important, and it gets called when your object gets instantiated. Hello and welcome to our demonstration, which is an introduction to classes in Python. In this example, we're going to be creating a class called network device. Our network device class will have a method, the method called setInfo. The setInfo class takes including self, which is the parameter which must always be included, and includes the name, OS type, IP address, username, for which there's a default value of Cisco, same with password. And what it will do is it will set these values once the class gets created, the object gets created from the class definition, and setInfo is called. So if we look down here at our main code, the first thing that we will do is we're going to create a network device called dev1. That is our object. In our object dev1, we are then going to call the method setInfo, and we're going to pass in dev1 ISOX and the IP address of 9.9.9.9. Remember, in methods, you can omit the passing of parameters and have them be set to their default values, which is what has happened here. We're going to do the same thing for device 2, and then we're going to call our function that we've defined here called print device info, which takes as a parameter the devices list and prints out the information in devices list in a nice format. So all we're doing, creating a an object from the class definition, setting the info, calling the method to set the info, doing the same thing for device 2, and then printing this information. If we run this application, what we should see is a nicely formatted list of the device objects that we have created. Device 1 with the OS type, the IP address, the username, and password that we have set. In the first example, you can see down below, we have set, in the first example, we did not set the username and password, and so it defaulted to Cisco and Cisco. In the second case, we did set the username and password, and in that situation, you can see from the output, the username was set to Chuck and the password set to secret. This is a simple and easy example of how you can define device objects using class functionality in Python. Hello and welcome to our demonstration that is a little bit more complicated of using classes to represent devices in Python. In this code, what we will be doing is we will be using our network device class object as well as a couple of functions, one called read device info and one called print device info. And if we go to the bottom of the file, what we can see is that what we will be doing first is we're going to read information from a file called devices, and then we're going to read information from a file called real devices, and we will print out the information from both that we've created. The output from this application is going to look something like what you see here. The first section is the information that we've read from the devices file, and the second is the information that we've read from the real devices. You may recognize these as being actual devices in the lab that I happen to be using, 10.30.30.1, etc. They're all iOS devices. Those are my real devices. Let's look at the code that accomplishes this. We've seen the main code that basically calls read device info and then calls print device info. Our creation of classes of our class for our network device is going to be within this read device info function. So let's look at read device info. Read device info is going to create a list called devices, and it's into this list it's going to put the information that it creates, the classes that it uses to create objects. And so first we're going to open the file. We're going to take our file information and strip it and split it so that it's put into this list. From this list, we are going to create our network device object using the information that we have just read in. So this is going to be the name. This will be probably the IP address, etc., etc. So these are in the appropriate order that will match these parameters that we're going to pass here. So when we read them in, you'll see that we have device info 2, that's the IP address. Device info sub 1, that is actually the OS type. If you remember from our file, the things were in the opposite order. IP address was after the OS type. So this is just how we happen to be using it in order to pass the information appropriately. This is how you use positional parameters when calling a function, which in this case is actually a method. And the method that is getting called here is the init method. Recall that within a class, when you define a class, when you create the class, as we are doing here, we're creating the class, you can create it with a set of parameters. Those parameters will get passed to your init function. And in the init function, you can set these local variables or attributes for your class. So what we're going to be doing is we're going to be creating a lot of network devices, and each of the network devices will have their own name, IP address, OS type, etc. This is what will be stored in my network device class when I create it here. I will take the device that I created. This is actually an object that was created from the class, and we will append it to our devices list. So at the end of this, our devices will be a list which has all of these objects that were created from network device. The print device info is going to go through the list of devices in our devices list. Notice that when we call print devices info, we're passing in devices list. Devices list is actually the name that is the variable that we set when as a return value from read devices info. Remember, read devices info returned the list, and inside this function we called it devices. Remember, variable scope is variables names are relevant and valid within the function. When we return this thing called devices, we're setting that to be actually devices list in our main application. So it doesn't matter what we called it here, we're calling it devices list here. And our print device info is passing devices list into the function. So here we're receiving devices list. Once again, this parameter name could be anything, but in this situation, we're happening to call it the same thing as we called it in the main program. And here we just go through all of the devices in devices list and print them out one at a time. And we're doing this twice, remember. First we do it when we read devices file, and the second time we're doing it when we read the real devices file. This is just showing that you can exercise this functionality, both the functions as well as the class, multiple times. This is the nice thing about organizing things into classes and functions. And once again, this was the output that we got. This is the information that was printed. These all became device objects, each one of these, when we read it in from a file. And the same thing is true when we read in the real devices. So this has been an example of using classes as well as functions. We've observed the init functionality that calls when we create an object from the network device class, passing in these attributes. The attributes get set here, and then we printed them out in our print devices info.